If anything significant was ever happening in Eudora, Arkansas, it was happening on Main Street. Main Street in the little town where I grew up is only 3 blocks long. It could barely accommodate the 2,500 to 3,000 citizens who lived there at the time, but everything of any significance that happened in our community happened right there on Main Street. So when Santa Claus came to town in late November, he came to Main Street to the Sears catalog store, and we lined up down the blocks to sit on Santa Claus's lap. The county fair ping pong ball drop happened on Main Street. You all are not familiar with this? Where the crop duster plane comes over Main Street and drops ping pong balls all over Main Street, and the children stand out in Main Street to catch them as they bounce around. And some of the ping pong balls have been slit and have slips of paper in them with prizes that you can get at the local stores. You people haven't lived, have you? You've never lived. Our annual Vacation Bible School parade happened on Main Street. We would decorate our bicycles and make posters, and the Sunday afternoon before Vacation Bible School started on Monday, we would ride our bikes and walk down Main Street screaming, "Come to Vacation Bible School, come to Vacation Bible School," in our best evangelical voices. I don't remember anyone new ever coming to Vacation Bible School, but it satisfied our need to use our evangelical voices as children and have a parade. In Eudora, everything significant happened on Main Street. In the Bible, everything of great significance happens on mountains. This year at Vacation Bible School, our children are going to be looking at one particular mountain, the Mount of the Beatitudes, and they're going to be studying the Sermon on the Mount for the next 24 hours. But over these next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at 3 different mountains, including the Mount of the Beatitudes. And the first of the mountains is Mount Sinai. The children read the 10 Commandments a moment ago. This is where the commandments were given. 10 Commandments we're familiar with, 613 total laws that we don't memorize as easily as the 10 Commandments. But the giving of the law happened at Mount Sinai. And the giving of the law turned Israel's world upside down. All of a sudden, these nomadic people who had been wandering around since their slavery with no real rubric or schedule or guidelines for life received some rules that they need to live by. And it did turn their world upside down. No other gods before me. Until this time, Israel had reverenced all sorts of gods, but now only the God of Israel who presented himself at Mount Sinai. You're going to honor a Sabbath. Remember, they've been working as slaves for 100, 200, 400 years, and now they're going to observe a Sabbath day of rest. Honor your mother and your father. These are the people, remember, Isaac's children tricked him, and then Jacob's children tricked him. These were people who were used to tricking their mothers and fathers and using their mothers and fathers, and all of a sudden, there are these rules that tell them to live differently. In the early days of Israel's faith, it was necessary to have some laws and rules to help them get on track. I think that's true for any of our lives. In the earliest days of our faith, we need laws and rules, black and whites, right and wrong, that help us to come into line and start to understand the nature of God. They were given a way of life. Some people need rules like that for the rest of their life. I know my daughter, who has struggled with an addiction and now is in recovery and doing well, has told me before, "Dad, I need rules. I need a rubric. I need a schedule. I can't change these things in my life." Now, she's wise enough to know that she can't impose that on everybody else because we don't all need that kind of ruling and scheduling and rubric. But for her life, she needs it. The rules were given at Mount Sinai. You heard them a moment ago. They're still good rules today. That's Mount Sinai. Now, when the people from all of those places that Martin read about a moment ago, that I'm not going to try to pronounce either, gathered together, they gathered at Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the traditional place of the site of the temple in Jerusalem. 3 times a year, Jewish people go or went for pilgrimages to Jerusalem during Passover, during Pentecost, and during Booths. And in Acts chapter 2, this is the pilgrimage of Pentecost. People had come from all over the Jewish world to worship and to be part of the Pentecost celebration. Acts chapter 2, interestingly enough, Pentecost is the celebration of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. But this year when they gathered together for Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, it wasn't just the law that they celebrated, but God gave the Spirit. And the law had to take a back seat to the Holy Spirit. God gave His Spirit to men and to women, to slave and to free and to Jew and to Gentile. And those who were standing around hearing this and seeing this said, wait a minute. The law differentiates between all of these things. The law differentiates between men and women and slave and free and Jew and Gentile. They can't be treated the same. But the Spirit expected us to mature beyond the letter of the law and to begin to live a prayerful life along with the Spirit, knowing how to love God better and how to love one another better than even the law could give us. The world is way more complex. We all know this. The world is way more complex than 10 commandments and 613 laws. John Claypool, before his death, was a good friend of mine for many years. I was honored to call him friend and honored to spend a good deal of time with him. I remember being at a conference where we were both speaking, and he got up to preach first at this particular conference. He shared the story of talking with another minister when he was younger, and the minister told him regarding the law and regarding the disciplines of his life. He said, John, you need to live like a train on the track. He said, a train rides on railroad tracks, and when it stays on the railroad tracks, that's when it rides the best and rolls the best and travels the fastest. Now, if that train tried to get off the tracks and go down into the meadow, if that train tried to get off the tracks and go across the lake, if that train tried to get off the tracks and go over the hill, if that train tried to get off the tracks and go up that mountain over there, the train would be completely debilitated and wouldn't be able to move. And do you understand what I'm saying to you, John? And John said he sat there for a moment and thought, and then he finally said, yeah, but I'm not a train. I'm a human being. I want to go walk in the meadow, and I want to go swim in that lake, and I want to peek over that hill, and I want to climb that mountain, and I'm not sure that my life was ever meant to be rigidly sitting on 2 rails going in one direction for all of my life. Most of us met sermonically through the book of Ruth. Well, how long ago has it been? 6 years ago, 5 years ago that I came and preached through a January in the book of Ruth. We're going to revisit Ruth this January. I'm going to go back through that for those of you who appreciated it. I need to revisit it. Those of you who did not visit those texts with me, do you remember the story? I'm going to tell you today because I know you're not going to remember it in January anyway. Do you remember the story? How Ruth decides she's going to go back to Bethlehem with Naomi after their husbands have died. And about halfway back, Ruth says to Naomi, you know, don't tell me to leave you, because where you go, I'm going to go, and wherever you live, I'm going to live, and where you dwell, I'm going to dwell, and where you die, I'm going to die, and where you're buried, I'm going to be buried. And then she says these words, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And in Hebrew, the text says Naomi went silent and said nothing to her. You see, back in the book of Deuteronomy, it said that Moabites, which is what Ruth was, could never be a part of the family of faith and never be a part of the Israelite family in any other way. And when Ruth said, your people are going to be my people and your God is going to be my God, Naomi could not give that to her because the law said she couldn't have it. But by the time we get to the end of the book of Ruth, Boaz wants to marry Ruth, and he takes Ruth to the front gate, and he calls all the elders of the town together, and he says, I want to take this person to be my wife. And it took it took at least 10 Jewish men to interpret the law, and those who had gathered there at the gate said, you may marry her, and may she be to us like Leah and Rachel and Sarah, the very mothers of our faith. The Spirit came at Pentecost to tell us that life is way more complex than 10 commandments or 613 laws. But walking with the Spirit, we can learn to love one another and love God well. It's the message of Pentecost on Mount Moriah. And may God's Spirit come and dwell us as we learn to care for one another and love our God. When the early believers wrote the New Testament, they had a hard job. They had to decide what words and what incidents from Jesus' life were actually going to be recorded. You remember John, in writing his gospel, said if everything had been written down, there had been thousands of volumes. So that they had to decide, what do we keep? What do we remember? What do we pass on to the disciples and the believers, the church that comes after us? And the church chose these significant words from the teachings of Jesus, what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And I think if I had to hone this sermon down to maybe just 2 points, because we preachers like points, the sermon essentially says to us, you need to learn to love like you have never loved before. And you need to learn to live like you have never lived before. Learn to get the most out of the relationships in your life and learn to get the most out of life that you can. And all of this really turns the world upside down, which is what our children are going to be studying for the next 24 hours. How does the Sermon on the Mount turn our lives upside down? How does it teach us to get more from what we are actually doing and living? Several years ago, I had been asked to preach at a youth camp one summer, and so I went to preach. And the second day that I was at the camp preaching, the youth minister who was sponsoring the camp had a death in their family, and they had to leave. And the youth minister came to me and said, "Thank you for coming, thank you for preaching. I'm going to have to leave for the rest of the week. I don't think that's going to affect many things, except," she said, "I'm filling in the kitchen during the day. Would you mind working in the kitchen during our meals as well?" You thought this was glamorous work I did when I leave, don't you? And I said, "No, I don't mind at all." So I showed up the first time at lunch to help, and I was put in charge of chopping apples, slicing apples, to put apple slices on the students' plates as they came through. And I had my chef knife, and I was going to town on these apples when someone in the kitchen looked over and said, "Who's throwing all this good apple away?" And I said, "Well, that's just the core." They said, "That's half the apple. That's not the core. You're just kind of cutting the edges off and putting them on place." And then they showed me how to actually cut an apple so that you got a lot more apple out of the apple than I was getting out of the apple. I'm proud of myself. I know how to cut an apple now. Speaking of apples, I have an Apple iPhone. Do you know that Jenna showed me that you can actually save people's phone numbers in your iPhone? You don't have to dial it every time. I'm getting more out of my Apple now. After playing the guitar for years, I finally decided to take lessons from Terry Cantwell. Terry showed me what tone was on a string and vibrato on a string, and how to think in phrasing with music and bring musicality to a song rather than just strumming. All I'd ever done was just strum. Most of us live our life the way we have lived our lives for years. We live them the way our dads and our moms taught us and our grandparents taught us, the way our church taught us, the way our region and our culture taught us, the way our particular generation taught us. We have all been living life the way life has been given to us by our context and our families. But here in the Sermon on the Mount, all of a sudden our lives are changed. The way we're chopping and the way we're strumming and the way we're saving and the way we're relating. Sermon on the Mount tells us to love and live like you have never loved and lived before. Stop worrying about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. God's got this. Find meaning in meekness and mourning and persecution, the things that most of us try to avoid. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Don't judge others. Forgive in the same manner in which God forgives you. You know, that's the stuff that turns worlds upside down. We have visited 3 wonderful mountains with our children this morning. Mount Sinai, we received the law that teaches us how to live our life. At Mount Moriah, we received the Spirit that teaches us how to prayerfully walk with God and understand how to apply that law the best in our life and in our world. They'll be reading the Sermon on the Mount for the next 22 hours to learn how living according to the teaching and the ways of Jesus turn our lives and our worlds upside down. We go into the world a different people, having been to these mountains.